In this last video, we're going to move down from the ecosystem level, the interaction of the biotic and abiotic components of a particular area, and talk more about communities. We're going to talk about the specific roles that communities have within their ecosystem. So you can sort of think about the role that an organism has in their ecosystem as their job. What do they do with their time and with their resources? Now, this job or this role in the community is called a niche. Some people call it niche. Honestly, not sure which way. I call it a niche. That's what I heard growing up. But anyway, the niche is the space that the organism occupies, the type and the amount of food that the organism needs, the reproduction times of this organism, the environmental and living condition requirements, the organism that it's its food source, and how it influences the other organisms or the other competitors within their environment. So any species is going to occupy a very specific niche. Now, you cannot have two species occupying exactly the same niche. They might utilize some of the same features of that niche, but it's the same thing as having two people do exactly the same job, live in exactly the same house, consume exactly the same resources all at one time. It's really not going to work. And so you have to have specific niches for each type of species. Now let's take, for example, this bald eagle. The range of this bald eagle is basically all of North America. There are some parts that it doesn't occupy, but almost all of North America. Now, this is the area that it can inhabit. Now, that doesn't mean that it is going to inhabit every single habitat within this particular environment, because there are certain places where the environmental conditions are not particularly conducive to bald eagle life, or their preferred prey species isn't in high numbers, things like that. And so there's a sort of the same thing can be thought of for the niche. There is the fundamental niche, or the whole niche, that the full range of conditions or environment that a particular species can occupy. And then there's the realized niche, which is the actual specific role and location in a community that this organism can occupy. So bald eagles may not occupy every single environment within the United States, but within this whole range, within the fundamental niche, they are going to occupy some particular places and find their actual realized niche. Now, the realized versus the fundamental is going to depend on what they're competing for, and what type of food and space is actually available for those organisms. Because you cannot have two species occupying exactly the same niche, you're going to have some competition. When the niches overlap, when the food source is similar, or the environment that they want to inhabit is similar, you're going to have competition. And when competition happens between two species, you're going to influence the structure of that particular community. So when competition happens, you can have one of three things happen. You can have something called competitive exclusion. Now, this is where one is completely excluded from the niche, driving the other to local extinction. An example of this is a laboratory experiment in which researchers grew two different paramecium. So paramecium are these little eukaryotic protists. They are single-celled eukaryotic organisms. Now, in the laboratory, they grow under, or can grow under, exactly the same conditions. And so researchers started out with these paramecium in exactly the same conditions, but in their own environment. And they noticed that if they mix them together one of two things happens. One is competitive exclusion. Now in this outcome, one of them outcompetes the other for the resources and drives the other to extinction. So in this case, they're illustrating that the green one was able to outcompete the purple one. Now it doesn't matter if this outcompetes it by a lot or just a little. If there's any advantage that this green one has, we're going to see natural selection favor these organisms because these guys are going to be excluded from utilizing their resources. Another possible outcome is something called resource partitioning. With these paramecium, they also saw that sometimes the organisms would sort of separate and utilize different parts of their environment. So you might have the green paramecium occupying the top part of the test tube environment and the purple ones utilizing the bottom. Now this is them dividing their resources. They're essentially sharing the same environment by utilizing different regions of it. So the paramecium are altering the way that they're using their environment and only inhabiting the top half. So although they could potentially inhabit the entire test tube, their fundamental niche is the entire test tube, they're only actually inhabiting a small portion, their realized niche. In the third option, we can have something called character displacement. Now, character displacement is natural selection changing the particular features of an organism. So a good example is Galapagos finches. So if you have two finches with medium-sized beaks occupying individual islands, they're going to eat a particular type of food source. Now, medium-sized finches or medium beak-sized finches can eat both large and small seeds. So at this point, we should be familiar with our finch examples. So these guys on two separate islands can eat a wide range of seeds. But if they are present on the same island, natural selection is going to work in a way that allows some of them to transition to one food source and the other to transition to another food source. So this is why we get the wide variety of beak sizes that we kept using as examples throughout this semester. Because natural selection is going to allow populations in one area to more successfully feed on one type of seed and populations in another area to more successfully feed on smaller seeds. And so we get a change in resource utilization, but that leads to change in the characteristics of the population. So we no longer see the medium-sized beak because the population has been selected toward large and small beaks based on their food choice. Now, this is what makes resource partitioning possible, this natural selective process that is allowing these organisms to utilize different resources within their niche. So now let's get to predators and prey. This is always an exciting one. So part of utilizing all of the resources in your niche is being able to successfully acquire your food. And a lot of the interaction in a particular community is going to be centered around competing for and obtaining resources. So you guys are probably all familiar with predation. Predation is an interaction between two species in which one eats the other. Now there's all kinds of extravagant examples of these: great white sharks eating seals and lions attacking gazelles and things like that. But it's not always this big, fantastic, huge predator. It's any situation in which one species is eating another. Predators are a strong selective force because if they can kill their prey, the prey is obviously going to die. They're not going to be able to pass on their genes to the next generation. And so predation is a very strong selective force. Those organisms that can avoid predation are going to have greater reproductive success, and they're going to pass on their genes for whatever trait it is that allows them to be more successful. On the flip side, those that are eaten are not going to pass on their genes, and because they have reduced reproductive success. They have reduced fitness because the predators are able to take them from the environment. The process of predation and the selection for particular traits is often a situation of coevolution. Coevolution is when two organisms evolve together. And they evolve traits in sort of an arms race, if you will. One will, if it's a predator-prey relationship, one might get faster and the other get bigger claws. Or one might have a stronger defense mechanism and the other might be more sneaky. And so coevolution of traits, whether they are interacting in a predator-prey relationship or whether they are reacting in a relationship that is beneficial, is going to lead to highly specific and unique adaptations. So predator-prey relationship is often this sort of co-evolution of strategies to get the prey and strategies to avoid being eaten. But there are other examples as well. Co-evolution of flower and insects is a really big one. Flowers have evolved ways to attract insects. Insects benefit from the flowers. So the plant, the flower, attracts the insect in, usually in an attempt to get nectar. When the insect gets into the plant, it rubs pollen. The pollen from the flowers gets rubbed on the insect, and then the insect goes to the next plant and feeds on the nectar of the next plant. When it does that, it transfers pollen. And this is how pollen is spread between plants and how the ovules of flowers are fertilized by other plants, because plants can't get up and mate. They're stuck where they are, and so they rely on other organisms to transfer their pollen to other plants. So our book uses this really cool example of this moth that has an 11-foot tongue that it rolls up inside its mouth. Now it is very specifically adapted to a particular orchid that has a really long nectar tube. And if it wants to get that nectar, this moth has to have a really long tongue. Now the advantage is that this moth can get the pollen that comes off of these little organs here at the end of the flower and transfer it to the next plant. And so this is coevolution. As the flower grew longer, the tongue also grew longer. Going back to predator-prey relationships, though, there are certain ways that, certain common ways that prey will defend themselves against predator species and just generally protect themselves from the environment. These types of structures fall into two categories: either physical defense or behavioral defense. So these are either physical or behavioral ways that organisms avoid being eaten. So the first of the physical defenses is a mechanical defense. So this is a physical structure that helps protect an organism from predation. So here we have a porcupine with its fantastic quills that are going to deter anyone from coming in and bothering it. Other types of mechanical defenses are hard shells or exoskeletons, things that are going to protect the animal if it happens to be attacked. Other things could be claws, fangs, stingers, anything that is going to reduce the chances of a predator or deter a predator from attacking you. The second type of physical defense is a chemical defense. So these are toxins or poisons. So these are either going to kill or harm your predator in some way, deter them from eating you. So this example of this poison dart frog secretes toxins through its skin. And if somebody tries to eat it, it's going to get a bad taste in its mouth. Now these are highly toxic, so not only is it going to get a bad taste in its mouth, but it's also probably going to die. Now these chemical chemical defenses are often displayed as brightly colored organisms. So predators have learned that brightly colored organisms are often poisonous. And so these organisms might be brightly colored, and predators learn that they want to avoid the brightly colored tree frog or other brightly colored organism. So the toxin is sort of the second line of defense. The first line of defense is the physical coloration of these organisms, as basically a warning sign to predators that says, I'm poisonous, stay away. Along with the chemical defenses, again, we have the warning coloration. So organisms are going to not only produce their toxic chemical, but they're going to warn their predators that they are potentially toxic. Now, one little sneaky thing that happens in the world of chemical defenses and coloration is something called mimicry. Now, mimicry is basically a harmless species co-opting the warning coloration, but not actually producing the toxin. So in mimicry, organisms that are not toxic tend to look like those that are, in the hopes that they can deter their predators without actually having to produce the toxin themselves. Another sort of passive type of defense is camouflage. So if you are hidden in your environment, you're less likely to be seen by the predators around you. So camouflage is a type of coloration that allows you to blend in with your surroundings. Now, this is quite effective because you don't have to have any special defense mechanisms, you just have to hide. And so we have this praying mantis here. You can see that he looks very similar to the blades of grass. Now, camouflage can be coloration. It can also be the shape and form of the organism. So sometimes insects have really fancy appendages and things that make them look like plants or flowers around them. Moths and butterflies often have coloration that allow them to blend in. Mammals have this too. Tigers have sort of opposite camouflage. They have camouflage to blend in so that they can be the predator, so that their prey doesn't see them. A lot of prey species such as gazelle, deer, things like that, they match the color of their surroundings. So when they lay down, they're harder for their predators to spot. Along with physical defenses, organisms often invoke behavioral defenses as well. So these are ways to deter your predator if they happen to come near you. So sometimes organisms hide or run, or both. Sometimes they're good at hiding, sometimes they're fast. Another behavioral strategy is working in groups. So if you're a large group of organisms, you basically have protection, because if anyone's going to get eaten, it's only going to be one or a few rather than the one that's by itself. And so predators will often use this strategy. They might attempt to separate some of the prey species from their group. So this schooling fish example shows a large group so that it reduces the risk of any one individual actually being eaten. And then we also have the fighting back defense. So this can take a variety of different forms. It might be physical fight. You might actually challenge the predator. You might kick them. You might chase them off, things like that. This example here shows a seagull that is, seabird, not a seagull, seabird, that actually vomits at whoever is trying to get towards its nest or trying to eat it. There's a lizard that shoots blood out of its eyes. Lizards will drop their tails, things like that. Anything to sort of distract the predator and keep them from being eaten. So not only do the prey species need to avoid being eaten, but the predators also need to be able to counteract the prey's defenses. So predators have evolved ways to increase their efficiency. So they might be faster, they might be stronger, they might be bigger. Now, this is related to something called the life dinner hypothesis. I find this interesting just because of its name. Basically, it says that the prey's adaptation, there's stronger selection for the prey to be able to escape than there is for the predator to be able to capture. Now, this makes sense if you think about the difference between being captured and not capturing. So if you are going to be somebody's dinner, if you are caught and eaten, you're not going to pass on your genes to the next generation. So you have a lot at stake. If you're going to be someone's dinner, your life is at stake. And so the traits that are going to allow you to escape predation are going to be under a stronger selective pressure than those traits that are only going to allow the predator to get their dinner. Because if the predator doesn't get the rabbit, if the fox doesn't get the rabbit, he's only losing dinner. But if the fox gets the rabbit is losing its life. And so there's stronger selection for the traits that are going to allow that rabbit to escape than for the fox to get its dinner, because it's likely that the fox can find dinner somewhere else. So there's another form of predation that I feel is often overlooked as a form of predation. So parasitism are basically predators that form a relationship with their host. So not all parasites actually kill their host. In fact, a lot of them require that their hosts stay alive, at least stay alive long enough to pass on to complete their own particular life cycle. So parasites fall into two categories. We have ectoparasites, and those are organisms that live on their host. So they might bite and attach to their host, but on the outside. So the example here is a bed bug. Bed bugs will bite individuals, and they require humans to complete their life cycle. We also have endoparasites, and those are parasites that live inside of their host. So they will invade their host and use some organ or system within the living organism to complete their life cycle. Now, very often with parasites, they actually require multiple hosts in order to complete their full life cycle. And often the symptoms that they induce in their host are part of that life cycle. So this particular one here, trypanosoma, causes African sleeping sickness. So it is a blood disease. It's a blood parasite that gets in and causes problems. So parasites are different than most predators that we would think of because they're not developing fantastic characteristics or traits that allow it to sneak up on and attack their host. You often don't know you're even exposed because they're really, really small. And they can enter your system in a variety of different ways. They require the ability to stay in contact with their host. Now, this may require special behavior changes or behavior characteristics or abilities to remain attached, things like that. They also have to be able to live off the host without killing it, or at least live off the host long enough to complete its life cycle without killing it. And then they also need a means of dispersal. And then another challenge for parasites is they often have very complicated life cycles. And this is because they have co-evolved with their hosts. And sometimes they have co-evolved the requirement for multiple host infections. And so these are some challenges that are not necessarily faced by your regular fast carnivore predators. So our book goes into some really interesting examples of parasites. I'm not going to go into all of these details. If you guys would like to read some of these in more detail, I would suggest it because I think the parasites are quite interesting usually to students. So parasites have some particular adaptations that actually can change the behavior of their hosts. And this behavior change is caused so that those parasites can complete their life cycle. So, for example, parasites might cause fearless behavior in their host. So they might cause behaviors that they wouldn't normally have. And that behavior will allow the parasite exposure to its next host or the next phase of its life cycle. Parasites can also induce aggressive or inappropriate reactions in their hosts. The example here is rabies. So foaming at the mouth and aggressive behavior is basically a symptom of rabies parasite infection. And the reason for this is that aggressive animal, the rabies affecting the organism in a way that makes them aggressive, makes it more likely that they'll bite another organism and the parasite can infect the next organism for its life cycle. Parasites can also cause just strange or risky behavior in their hosts. So again, I'm not going to go through all of these examples just for time's sake, but it is quite interesting if you want to read through that section. Right, not all interaction is negative. So we've spent a lot of time focusing on predator-prey, parasite-prey interactions. But in fact, a lot of the interactions in an environment are neutral. They might be mutual, where these are non-negative interactions. So in a mutual interaction, both organisms are going to benefit from it. So a perfect example of this is a flower and a pollinator. The pollinator gets the nectar from the flower gets its pollen spread so that it can reproduce. You can also have something called commensalism, which is where one benefits but the other basically is neither hurt nor gains anything. So the example here is a cattle egret. It hangs out on the back of Cape buffalo and other large mammals and eats the insects off of them. But because they're small and light and don't do anything but eat bugs, the Cape buffalo is not harmed in the interaction. So not all interactions are bad, and sometimes they're neutral. Sometimes you can interact without benefiting or having a negative impact on the other individual. So flipping gears a little bit, let's get down to how communities change over time. Now, there's a particular progression of change. When communities change, they follow a very particular progression. Now, this progression is often due to a particular disturbance in an environment. So think of this as a massive disturbance. Let's say the formation and then the melting of a glacier, or a forest fire that's really hot and fast and burns up everything. When you study these types of environments, you can study how you get from an environment with nothing to an environment with something. So the first step in this succession, this change over time in a community, it's called primary succession. So in primary succession, you have no life, no soil. After that, life begins to take over and to proceed through a series of steps. You can also have secondary succession. This is where a habitat is disturbed and there's some life there, and so life can sort of quickly take over once the disturbance is gone. So primary succession is going to start at a point where we have no life and no soil. So think of volcanic rocks. Think of receding glaciers where all you have is exposed rock. Secondary succession is going to occur after something like a forest fire or a flood where maybe most of the life is wiped out, but there's still some life and there's still soil. Soil is an important step in succession. So in primary succession, when there's no life to begin with, you first have to sort of make the conditions that are important for life. So things like fungi, bacteria, seeds are going to first colonize this particular area of primary disturbance where you have no soil. Now the reason that these guys come in first is that they don't require soil. And in fact, bacteria, lichen, things like that are actually going to break down rocks and start to produce soil. Once soil begins to, or once these guys start to produce soil, then colonizers can come in. Colonizers are going to be the first species to arrive. And they're often things that come from seeds. So they're often small plants whose seeds have dispersed into this area. The reason that colonizers do this is that they're good dispersers. They can move easily into a particular area. So once we have some soil and once colonizers start coming in, we enter what we call intermediate communities. Now, intermediate communities step through a particular series of events. Basically a series of events where you get larger and larger plants, and with those plants come the animal life. So if you have starting at secondary succession, so this is where something comes through and removes most of the plant life, most of the animal life, but not the soil, you're going to have quick regeneration. Or when you've gone from primary to secondary succession and now you have soil. You're going to first start to see mosses and other very small plants. And these are going to provide some moisture and they're going to provide protection for larger plant seeds to come in. Once you get that protection from those mosses, you start to see small herbs, maybe some small shrubs taking place, and they're going to outcompete first the mosses and then the herbs. Very often grasses appear early in this secondary succession process. After that, in our intermediate communities, we're going to start to get larger and larger trees. So you can see if we follow this, not just in the little squares, but within the squares, we're starting to see a progression to larger and larger plants and larger and more established trees. And then eventually, we're going to reach what we call a climax community. This is where you have longer living, larger species that have outcompeted all of these initial species. And this is going to be your most stable and self-sustaining community. Now, it might not make much sense, but disturbance is actually really important for communities. There's often a requirement for communities to have some level of disturbance. And that will take the community back to an earlier stage. Now, this is important because it allows for greater species diversity. When you remove some of these climax organisms, you make room for some of these smaller, less competitive species. And that actually allows for more diversity, not only in the plants that are there, but in the animals as well. And when you have a more diverse ecosystem, it's going to be a healthier ecosystem. So healthy ecosystems are often determined by something called a keystone species. So a keystone species is a species that has an unusually large influence on the other members of the community. Now, sometimes these are top carnivores. I posted a video about wolves in Yellowstone, that they're going to be your tertiary consumer in the ecosystem, but their effect goes past eating secondary individuals. Those tertiary predators actually regulate all of the levels below them and contribute to a healthy ecosystem. But sometimes your keystone species are not the largest predators. In this example here, we have sea stars that actually help regulate the environment around them. And they do this by regulating some of the species that they would normally eat. Because without them there, these black clams will take over the environment. They'll outcompete all of these other organisms, whether it is because they're consuming them as a food source or just competing for their particular niche. And if you remove these sea stars, you end up with a community that basically has no biodiversity. It's made up of one particular species. But this keystone species, by regulating these black clams, is actually allowing for an increase in biodiversity in the entire area. So by preserving a particular keystone species, you're actually helping the community to regulate its own biodiversity. So a lot of conservation efforts will actually focus on identifying keystone species, because by protecting those and regulating those, you allow the entire ecosystem to sort of self-regulate.